Who was overrated? Who was underrated? Which teams were better or worse than their record? We're going to look at how every Big Ten team performed in one-score games in 2024. And again, this kind of just tells us which teams were very close to having a much different season, a much better season, a much worse season. Also, again, tells us which teams maybe were underrated or overrated, and the teams that you can expect to really improve next season, because the teams don't normally, it's kind of just how it works. If you win a lot of close games one year, the odds tell you you might lose all the close games the next year. You never know how it's going to go. And looking back to 2023 to see which trends we could find, Indiana was 2-4 in one-score games. That kind of tells you, hey, they should bounce back and be better in those close games the next year. I don't think, there are obviously so many factors. This is a totally different team, new coach and all that. But that was one of the teams. Also, we had Iowa 5-1 in one-score games in 2023. So they were really good, and they lost some of those games this year. Northwestern 5-2 in 2023 in one-score games. So their record went down. Nebraska was 1-5. They could not win the close games, but again, Nebraska, that's just Nebraska. That's who they are. So no real reason to expect that to change, because it's been every year there at Nebraska. But let's jump right in, starting with the teams at the top of the Big Ten: Oregon, Penn State, Indiana, Ohio State, Illinois, and Iowa. So how did these teams perform in one-score games? Oregon was 3-0. They did not lose a close game. Didn't lose a game, period, obviously, in the regular season. Penn State was 3-1. They were very good in the close games. Indiana only played one, and they were 1-0. We had Ohio State 2-2. Illinois, very good in the close games, 4-1. Big part of the reason why they did go 9-3. They had a really good season. Could they potentially drop off next year? I know this is a team that, if you followed me, I cannot predict Illinois. I just can't for whatever reason. Iowa, talked about how they had a very, very good record in the close games in 2023. Well, this year, not as good, 1-2. So if these teams won all of their close games, again, this would kind of have been the perfect storm, the best case scenario for these teams. What could have been the type of season that could have been for these teams? Oregon still would have been 12-0, Penn State 12-0, still would have been in the playoff. Indiana still 11-1. Ohio State could have been 12-0. Again, both their losses were close. Illinois could have been 10-2. Iowa could have been 10-2. So you see how close Illinois and Iowa were to being in that playoff conversation. Now, how about if these teams lost all of their close games? Oregon could have been 9-3, so this is kind of worst case scenario. Oregon could have been 9-3 if they lost those close games. Penn State could have been 8-4. So you see, just a few plays away from not even being in the college football playoff. Indiana could have been 10-2. Ohio State could have been 8-4. Again, could have missed the playoff. Wasn't that far away from missing the college football playoff. I look back at that Nebraska game. That's a game they could have lost. They were pretty fortunate in that one. And now, of course, they're playing for national championship. Illinois could have been 5-7. Could have missed out on a bowl game. And then Iowa could have been 7-5. Really not much difference there. So now, how good of these teams really are? I wouldn't say how good are they, but what should their record have been if they, again, had split these close games? And that is interesting. So Oregon, 10.5 wins. So 10-2 or 11-1. Penn State would have been 10-2. Indiana, just like Oregon, 10.5 wins. Ohio State still would have been 10-2 because they split their close games. And then Illinois, not quite as good of a season, 7-5 or maybe 8-4. And Iowa, again, could have possibly gotten up to 9-3 if, again, they just won one of those close games. So let's go now to the next set of teams. And just big picture here, what's the big takeaway? Not really a big takeaway here. Maybe Illinois, again, was a little overrated. Penn State and Oregon maybe a little overrated, but I wouldn't read too much into that. All right, now, again, let's go to the next teams. We got Michigan, Minnesota, Rutgers, Washington, USC, and Nebraska. So how did these teams perform in the one-score games? Michigan was 2-0 in 2023, and they were good in the close games again. So they've done it back-to-back years. It tells you a lot about the culture of that program, and the fight of that team, going 4-1 in one-score games. Minnesota 3-4, Rutgers 3-3, Washington 1-2, USC 3-5, Nebraska again. Nebraska struggles in the close games. Like I said, usually this kind of averages out, but you look at Michigan, they've been good in the close games for actually the last 3 years. In fact, I think they were 2-0 in 2022 as well. If that's right, then they're 8-1 in one-score games the last 3 seasons. And Nebraska, I don't even know what their record would be. And you could probably go back 10 years. It is awful. USC, another team that kind of struggles in those close games. Will that turn around next year? Will we see USC finally break through and win these close games? Same thing for Nebraska. That's, an indication that they could potentially have a big turnaround. Not saying that's going to happen, but it's possible. And there is definitely potential for that. So if these teams won all their close games, Michigan still would have been 8-4. So, not much different there. But check out Minnesota. Minnesota could have actually gotten to 11-1. Minnesota was not that far away from being in the playoff conversation. So that's crazy. Rutgers could have been 10-2. Washington 8-4. And then there's USC and Nebraska. And again, all but one of their losses were one-score games. So USC and Nebraska 6-6, but they were not that far away from being 11-1, which is just crazy. And it just tells you the importance of winning those close games. And if they can do that next year, I'm telling you, especially Nebraska, because the momentum they've got with their roster, maybe not so much with USC, but Nebraska could really turn things around. I know we say that every year. I do this at the end of every season, and we say it every year. Okay, well, next year, if Nebraska can win these close games, and they just continue to not get it done. So we'll see. Do they finally break through next year? Only time will tell. So how about if these teams lost all their close games? Michigan could have been 3-9. Minnesota 4-8. Rutgers 4-8. Washington 5-7. USC, you talk about a big swing. They could have been 11-1 if they had gone 8-0 in those close games. They could have been 3-9 if they had lost all of them. So that's a big difference. And Nebraska, same thing there, 5-7 would have been kind of their worst case scenario. Kind of tells you the ceiling of these teams. Washington and Nebraska actually have a higher ceiling, or had a higher ceiling last season in terms of record than Michigan and USC, Minnesota, Rutgers. So that's interesting. Now, how about if these teams split all their one-score games? So this is really, in my opinion, what their record really, this really indicates how good these teams were in terms of record. So Michigan 5.5 wins, Minnesota 7.5 wins, Rutgers still 7-5, Washington 6.5 wins, USC 7-5, Nebraska 8-4. So again, this tells us Nebraska and USC were better than their record would suggest. And maybe Michigan. And Michigan's kind of different because I would say that they were not as good as their record suggests, at least midway through the season. This is a team that got really good late, and they were a different team. So again, this does not tell the whole story. These are just numbers. There's something to look at that can, these can give us an indication of which teams could possibly turn things around or drop off next season. So the final teams now: UCLA, Michigan State, Wisconsin, Northwestern, Maryland, and Purdue. If these teams, or let's first look at what they did in their one-score games. UCLA was really good in the close games, 5-2. Michigan State 3-2. Wisconsin only played one-score game. That's crazy. Northwestern 2-1. Maryland 1-1, and Purdue 0-3. If these teams had won their one-score games, UCLA could have been 7-5. Michigan State could have been 7-5. Wisconsin could have been 6-6. So those teams are really not far away from making a bowl. Northwestern, Maryland, Purdue, they still would not have made it to a bowl game. And then if these teams lost all their one-score games, UCLA would have been 0-12. So all of their wins were one-possession games. So this team, you could argue, maybe wasn't as good as we thought, or as good as their record would suggest. But they also played a really tough schedule. So again, there are so many different factors here. This does not tell the whole story. Michigan State could have been 2-10. Wisconsin still 5-7. Northwestern 2-10. Maryland 3-9. And Purdue still 1-11. So if these teams split their one-score games, UCLA only 3.5 wins, Michigan State 4.5, Wisconsin 5.5, Northwestern 3.5, Maryland 4-8, and then Purdue at 2.5 wins. So all of these teams, I wouldn't say any of these teams were underrated. I wouldn't say any of them just had bad luck. These were just not great teams. That's just the truth of it. So really no trends here with these final teams. So again, that's every team in the Big Ten, what their records were in one-score games, and again, what could have been both on the positive and negative side, and then we again average that out. So we'll do this for every Power 4 conference. The SEC will be up next, so I'd love to hear your thoughts, your comments on all this. Let me know down below.